Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, Vincent Perez. Today, we're going to have Erika Gonzalez Jones. Erika is a stalwart advocate for young people and educators in our school systems. Erika is a regular participant in our Equity Institute collective, where we gather and take care of ourselves in our own circle, and a consistent collaborator with various projects, from addressing dehumanizing language to looking at the experience of Black women. It is an honor always to serve with her. Please welcome Erika Gonzalez Jones. Thank you so much for being here, Erika. I'm so grateful for your time. For our audience, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what is your connection to public education?
Yes, Milce Kentenemi na natoka Erika Gonzalez Jones. Hello, my name is Erika Gonzalez Jones, and I'm a Black Indigenous Chicana that also has grandmothers from England, Ireland, and Spain. I'm a proud nerd, amateur mushroom forager, a self-described autodoc, a mommy to 2 cats and a dog, a partner, an auntie of 15 nibblings, the newest, just born over a month ago. You know, I'm a storyteller, healer, traveler, cloud-gazing, forest-bathing, water-loving bookworm.
That introduction. Thank you.
My formal training is as a bilingual elementary education and child educational psychology educator. But really, I would say that my background in being an educator goes back to when I myself was a student. I always found myself tutoring, being a camp counselor every summer. And then I also had numerous siblings and cousins, right? I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of so-called immigrants, you know, air quotes, because we have lived on this land since time immemorial. But, you know, they didn't speak English. And so ironically went through the whole naturalization, again, quotes, process. So I was an educator in that respect. I've been an advocate and educator, you know, since I was a child. Although I didn't initially go to university for education, kind of had this almost spiritual experience that made me change my major to education. And so I'm also an educator that left the classroom fairly quickly, which happens more often, as we know, to educators of color. And now I work to prevent that from happening.
You know, there's something in there I appreciate you mentioning as siblings and cousins. The natural learning that happens in these family groups, right? Especially I think about cousins, and especially because there are more of them, you know, often that the olders always take care of the youngers. Yep. And it's just such a natural human experience of teaching and learning that's always happening. So
absolutely
appreciate that kind of insight and naming that as part of your formal or just the history and where your roots are as an educator. I'm curious, with that kind of, you know, with that broad perspective from familial to even naming the time in the classroom, what is the purpose of public education?
So there's a saying in Spanish, el saber es poder, right? Knowing is power. The more one knows, the more powerful one is, right? There's also something else that's coming up for me when I was thinking about this. John Dewey says that education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. And although we can have a long conversation about Dewey, that's another podcast. But that saying resonates for me. And it kind of speaks to the ancestral ways of knowing and even being that I have been coming back to. And I say coming back to because those ways were stolen from me, right? From many of us. We could also have this conversation about how schooling from its inception is inherently racist. And I think it's important to acknowledge that for sure. But if I'm talking about true education as my ancestors knew it, then we're talking about education that is holistic, it's experiential, it's intergenerational. It comes from the world around us. And so not only including the Mother Earth, Madre Tierra, but our animal and plant relatives, right? Comes from everything. But even specifically speaking to the notion of education being intergenerational, how I was mentioning earlier, right? Like not only was my family my first teachers, but I also taught them. So there was this educational mutuality that happened between my parents, my grandparents, the older relatives, and then the younger relatives. I learned from them, they learned from me. And it was whether, it was teaching, whether it was them teaching me how to be part of a community, a family, or allowed me to contribute to the family by learning how to do things like cooking and taking care of siblings, to imagining, to dreaming and playing, right? Or me teaching my grandparents how to navigate systems in this new, quote, country, right? Not new, because we've been here since time immemorial. But, like whether that was education or the medical systems or even just navigating the unspoken rules of society. And so public education it's where you get to share your brilliance and your abundance with the world and engage with others sharing theirs with you. Which is so funny because I was listening to a video just the other day that they were interviewing educators in Finland and asking kind of essentially the same question, like, what's the purpose? And one of the educators said, well, our purpose is to help children find what they're passionate about, and for them to share that with the world. And I feel like that really fits with what I believe.
There's something in that sharing, in this exchange, that we're not just kind of receptacles for information, but that we're actually going to interact with one another. So I'm curious from that kind of point of view, in that it is this experience back and forth. And even as I mentioned, right, olders to youngers, the concept of that we're going to learn from our students too, right? It's not we're just like the all-knowing, we're going to be wrong and we're not going to not know. And so when does that get to happen? And young people get to teach us as well. So I'm curious, what have you seen really work in this realm, or just even in this kind of deeper purpose of sharing your brilliance and your genius with the world?
Yeah, well, there's this really beautiful thing that happens when you are your most authentic self, right? Which changes, of course, because you grow. But in whatever moment that you're in, when you're sharing that most authentic self, it's like you almost give permission for other people to share their most authentic selves. You're both coming with vulnerability, with the gifts that you bring, and really you're just kind of creating this moment in time together where you're co-designing essentially what the learning looks like or what the relationship looks like, right? And it all comes back to relationship. So it's just this really beautiful way that if I'm giving you all of who I am, there's going to be something in there that you can learn from. It's also going to give you space to do the same thing for you, where I'm going to learn from you and pick up on that. It is really reciprocal and it's really beautiful. And I don't think that we always think of learning in that way, right? When I was in the classroom, training very much was like, you never tell a student you don't know. And I've never believed that. I would tell my students, oh, I don't know. Why don't we find that out together? Right? Because then that humanizes you, right? And humanizes them. It allows them to grow. It allows them to have curiosity. And so you're in that moment together, you're learning together, you're sharing all of that brilliance and wisdom, and you're finding it together, right? You're both sharing it with each other, but you're also finding more.
Learning how to learn is what I hear in that.
Absolutely.
This sounds very, I want to go to your class, right? This sounds very appealing, and I think there's an element, like a presupposed of safety in there, in this idea. If I can bring my whole self in, well, you probably have to feel safe, in order to be so. B, is there time that fosters that? So with our current system, what challenges do you see to that kind of engagement? What are the challenges to really living that out? And how do you respond to those?
Yeah, I would say that a really significant challenge would be disconnection from self, from community, from the land, water, animal relatives, right? And so we're so good at being socialized to do one thing that we're being disconnected from everything else. Another thing that I would see as a challenge is apathy or a lack of curiosity. And then both of those speak to like the big disconnection, which is white supremacy in and of itself. White supremacy, which perpetuates this false sense of what true education is, and it turns education into schooling, right? So the system as a whole in society, it's about schooling. It's not about education. And, within that, there's, of course, a bunch of other things, but like lack of funding, right? Funding, lack thereof. But I started with disconnection because, again, I already mentioned it, relationships are really important, and it all comes back to relationships, right? So if you're in my class, like we're going to get to curriculum and instruction, but we're not going to get there until we have built community with each other, until I can learn about you, you can learn about me, until we can be in community together, until we can set the container, right? We're going to co-create the container of what being in our classroom looks like together. Because if I'm telling you this is what it's going to look like, that's not going to work. You have to be able to be in the creation of what that looks like for you to actually feel safe, right? And so really building relationship at the beginning of anything. I would say that that's true for, you know, outside of school, like in a job, whatever it is that you're doing, really getting to know and connect with those people that you are going to be learning with, working with, growing with, then everything else comes after that, because you'll be able to feel safe enough to take risks, to be vulnerable, to try new things, to make mistakes, so to speak.
Connection before content, huh?
Absolutely. 100%. 100%.
Or that's also like Maslow before Bloom, right? Something like that. That we community before dogma. I just want to make a bunch of those up.
Yes. See a bunch of t-shirts, a bunch of buttons.
So I'm curious about, in your experience, what examples do you have of that connection building, and how do you sustain that?
Well, I was thinking about, right, the question of like, what are frameworks, approaches, mindsets, perspectives, ideologies, right, that kind of influence how I go about this co-creation, this cultivation of space. And I'm a very syncretic person, not only when it comes to cosmology, but epistemologically also. Thinking of, right, community, cultural wealth, Dr. Tarayoso, which I know that you very much are a fan of that work. I think of things like Four Pivots, Dr. Sean Ginwright. I think of Freedom Dreaming by Robin D.G. Kelley and others. Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race, right? I think of all of these different frameworks or perspectives. Malidoma, Patrice Somé. I mean, right? There's like so many that I can name: Bettina Love, Gloria Anzaldúa, Kimberly Crenshaw, Adrienne May Brown, Bell Hook, Dr. Angela Davis, James Baldwin. And all of these people would name their people who have influenced them. I've been fortunate really to be a part of I'll name 4 specific communities that where I've seen this happen, right? Like this community, this brilliance sharing, co-creation happen. That's ECLC, which is the Educators of Color Leadership Community, which is through PSESD. There's ITALC, Institute for Teachers of Color Committed to Racial Justice. MALCS, Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social, and Equity Institute, right? All of these spaces that really do focus on humanizing, right? And what happens when you humanize is you get connection, right? You get connection and you connect to yourself, to others. You co-create to create these systems that will really make that connection possible. It doesn't depend on if one person's in the room, but it's this system that happens of really putting down foundation so that connection can happen. And it's beautiful because there's this loving accountability that happens in all of these spaces, right? Where we're going to grow, we're going to stretch, we're going to wrestle with some concepts and questions and mindset. But we're going to do it in a way that we're going to keep the dignity of each person at the forefront so that somebody can say, right, like, I don't know if I agree with this, I don't know if I agree with that, or this is how I think. And then we can get curious and ask questions, kind of just figure out what that looks like. There's the space to change minds. It's just a wonderful way to really stay curious, to stay connected. And what happens is you end up flourishing, you end up thriving in those spaces, right? That allows you to take bigger risks, it allows you to be more vulnerable, right? It just, what is the saying? Like, love begets love, right? So like that just keeps happening.
You know, I really believe that. Studied men's violence a lot and really thinking about like in trauma-informed care, healing-centered approach, right? So is that trauma begets trauma, and healing begets healing. There is something about finding, those the stops in those cycles, which you said a few things in here I'm curious about, really curious about dignity, how to support that, create that, maintain that, sustain that, and also something about consent in there as well. And from an indigenous epistemology, my experience and my learnings, for instance, before I pick up an animal skin drum in my heart to ask permission of this animal, which gave its life for this purpose of ceremony, and it just has to be done within yourself. You don't have to make a big hoo-ha about it, but it's just within your own heart. And there's something about the culture of consent in that to me. So I'm curious, when you mentioned indigenous epistemology and dignity, is that tied in any way for you? And what's your experience of that?
And I think for me, before I could put words to it, like I'm thinking of my grandfather, right? Who really kind of taught us about integrity, right? Integrity in everything that you do, just in the way that you move in life, right? And so doing what is right, quote unquote, right, no matter who's watching. And with that, in that, right, if I'm doing right by anyone, right, like in my classroom, if I'm trying to do right by every student that's in the classroom, well, I have to have a relationship with every student in the classroom, because I can't just assume what's right for them. I have to have that conversation with them, because they are going to let me know what's right for them, right? And dignity is tied into that, because then that becomes, one, I employ curiosity to have those conversations, right? Because I'm not going to have the same upbringing or family makeup, or whatever it is, as every student in that class. And so if I can ground in curiosity, right? If I can work through integrity, ground in curiosity and love, and build relationship with that student to show up, as I mentioned earlier, as their most authentic self, then really that's an extension of offering dignity. Like, you're going to show up in your most authentic self, however you show up as you are in this moment, right? And sometimes that looks like maybe not showing up as your best self because you're having a really hard day, or maybe you didn't have dinner, or maybe, whatever the case may be. There's so many things that happen in the lives of our students that they then have to come to school. And oftentimes, the way that schooling is set up, we ask them to leave that at the door. And so for me, doing that, right, if I'm asking a student to leave something at the door, I feel like that takes a little bit away from their dignity. It doesn't allow them to show up as who they are in that moment. So if I can say, bring everything that you are in this moment, in your grumpy self, in your hungry self, in your upset self, then that's an extension of dignity. That's an extension of, I see you as a human. I see you in all your complication, in all your simplicity, in all the contradictions. And I'm saying that's great. I'm not going to validate you, right? But I'm going to say that's valid how you show up. I'm going to make space for you to feel your own validation in that.
Really powerful. Even the idea of integrity, which I think the word gets used often, right? And as you mentioned, right, do the right thing when no one's looking. But I think you take it further. Integrity is honoring, engaging the dignity of others as well in that doing. It's beautiful. So if there were a calls to action, right, a calls to practice, even to live this out, to live, as educators of integrity, which honor the dignity of our learners and ourselves and our colleagues, right? What would it be? Like, what would you say? Okay, let's start doing, keep doing, or even stop doing?
As a Black Indigenous Chicana, there's an ancestral abundance that I bring, right, from my own ancestors, from my own peoples. And then many of like the philosophies or the influences that I mentioned earlier kind of all speak to values that I hold dear of self-awareness, relationships, curiosity, equity, empathy, joy, and love, right? And so we need folks to not only acknowledge that we all must come together constantly to educate ourselves and each other, but we have to commit to developing our own self-awareness and building genuine relationships and communities, right? There's the school of thought that education can't be political, but we know that's not true. We know that's not true. Teaching and education is political. For me at this moment, this looks like diversifying the educator workforce, thus achieving representative parity of our educators and our students and families. It's like where my brain is right now, especially because of what I do. It looks like creating equitable, inclusive school cultures and communities. It's approaching education through, again, that lens of holistic, experiential, intergenerational, place-based, education. It looks like as a society advocating, for true, like for complete funding of education, preschool to post-secondary, without crippling debt, right? It's never made sense to me that education isn't funded. Because don't we want our citizens to be literate, compassionate people? I know I do, right? So let us work towards creating space for all of us to share our intelligence, whether it's emotional, cognitive, creative, whatever intelligence it is, because we all have our own intelligence. One simple way to start is to get curious about everything. I think that's for me, one of the main things that I share with people is to be curious about yourself, about others. Curiosity is the antidote for that apathy that I mentioned earlier that allows us to grow through discomfort. So sorry.
I've actually heard this very concept, and it's more of a practice. It's more of a doing, I think, in terms of curiosity, where I think it's action. And Peter Levine, who is an author, trauma informed, Bessel van der Kolk, Elizabeth Stanley, Judith Herman. I've explored all of these thinkers and practitioners. And there was a question asked to Peter Levine about who actually heals. Okay, name it, right? Whether experiencing terrorism or being in war or just violence of all sorts, childhood sexual abuse, just all the horrible things that can happen to us as humans. The question that was posed to Peter Levine was who actually heals? And it was a really interesting, and he paused and basically came back to those who are curious. So it's very affirming to hear, right? To hear you as a practitioner, you see this out, right? The other practitioners, other researchers. How do we cultivate curiosity?
Again, it goes back to relationship and the idea of co-creating space, right? If I'm in a relationship with you, I can really invite you into curiosity about things. See, even things that we might be, that we might bump heads on, things that we might be on the opposite spectrum of thinking of. If we're in relationship, I have that ability to really engage you through curiosity to see a different point of view, a different perspective. And if we're in relationship together, then there's ways that we can also get curious together, right? Maybe we both have our ideas of, I say strawberry is the best ice cream. You say chocolate, let's get curious. And then maybe we go and try Rocky Road, and maybe we try, mint chocolate chip, or, we then arrive through curiosity, through engagement, and through our relationship and building of that relationship to see what else is out there. And I know that's kind of silly because I use ice cream flavors, but that idea of if we're in relationship, then I can invite you into more curiosity, right? And so it all starts with relationship, because you can engage people that you don't particularly have a relationship with into a stance of curiosity. It's going to be a lot harder, and it's going to be a lot easier for that person to disconnect. And if there's discomfort, say never mind. But if we're in relationship and we have each other's humanity at the forefront of that, right? If we're extending dignity to each other, if we're in relationship and hold integrity as a value, then even if we disagree, right, we're not going to lose relationship. We're not going to lose we're going to be tethered together still, right? So relationship is really big. And so there's so many different ways that we can think about what does curiosity look like, right? I've often heard from you, as an educator, you think about what are the right questions to ask, right? And so that's curiosity. How do we think about what we're asking, what questions we're asking? How do we think about what we're trying to find out? How do we think about what we're thinking about, right? Epistemologies, how do we engage with all of that? Like through curiosity and through vulnerability, through risk taking, if we're in relationship with each other.
And even for me, that concept of right question, I'm even reframing, is what are the questions that bring us the most good? What are the questions that give us the most connection, the most healing,
Love
right?
that.
The most learning, the most freedom, the most life-giving actions and behaviors, right? So, because even when I ask the question, right, what are the right questions? There implies there's some wrong questions, right?
Right.
And
I love that reframe.
the most abundance, right, in all of these areas of life. I'm curious, your educational experience, K-12 especially, um, what was the impact for you?
I was good at schooling. Again, I've always considered myself an autodidact, so that certainly helped. But not only that, I was amicable, I was determined, I was also compliant and assimilated. So that means I gave up a lot of myself. A lot of my ancestral and cultural abundance that I was blessed with through my family, my culture, my community. I gave a lot of that up to be good at schooling.
Wow.
I did have a traumatic experience, right? And so, long story short, I was speaking Spanish, and a teacher physically hurt me while screaming at me. Speak English, we're in America. When I tell you, I stopped speaking Spanish for more than a year, which was huge considering my grandparents didn't speak English, who we were in the same household, right? I still have a visceral response when I speak Spanish. And so all of that to say, right? All of that to say I was really good at schooling, but I gave up a lot of who I was to be good at schooling, to succeed, to be applauded, to, get the awards, to do all the things. And so now I'm committed to the reclamation of my indigeneity in all of its aspects, my ancestral knowledge, my ways of being. And again, I'm committed to not only modeling that and doing it for myself, but to helping create space for others to be able to do so as well. Right. And I also have to constantly remind myself to practice that curiosity. Right. I've always considered myself a loquacious person. I love words. And then I have to get curious and ponder, is that because white supremacy insists on worship of the written word? Or is that because I'm a nerd? It's probably a little bit of both. Right. But I have to ask those questions. It's National Latina Heritage Month, right? Also known as Hispanic Heritage Month or Latina Heritage Month. And I'm proud of being Mexican. And I also have to stay curious, and I have to ask questions and learn about the anti-Blackness and the anti-indigeneity that happens in Latina cultures. And I have to work to dismantle it, right? And I see that as something that stems out of the loss that I suffered from being good at schooling, right? It's something that I continually go back to say, well, I want to show up and I want to create space for folks to show up in a way that I couldn't when I was being, quote, good at schooling. It sticks with you. It stays with you for life.
For a lifetime.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I'll ever not have a visceral reaction when I'm speaking Spanish. I don't know if that'll ever go away, all because of that experience that I had in school, right? Which I had that experience and I doubled down. I doubled down on being good, quote, at school. Oh, okay, like I'm not going to speak Spanish. Like I'm going to use the biggest words that I can. I'm going to show this teacher that I can do all these things that she doesn't think I can do, linguistically speaking, right? I doubled down. So I lost more.
Wow. As I do these interviews, I hear stories, they're coming out, right, of all the kind of horrendous, as Dr. Bettina Loves notes, right, spirit murder, right, crushing experience as children. And you mentioned teaching is a political act. I strongly, wholeheartedly agree. Just from the structure, compulsory education is an arm of the government. And a lot of teachers don't kind of acknowledge this, but I'm like, this, just the structure, just the system, it's the law. There's a whole legal structure. So that teacher enacting this harm on you, I would say, is highly political.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Which makes it even, and I was in a community where I would say probably 87% of the community was Spanish speaking, and that happened.
Wow. There's similar stories in my lineage of why my Spanish is not very good because of being suspended for speaking Spanish. Not in my life, but in my lineage. And so therefore the institution creates this element of self-hate. I would go that far.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely.
If you're not actually speaking to your grandparents anymore for a year because you were shamed into saying this is not allowed or good, or it's bad, right? It's put in this category of certainly othering. That's just really heavy. It's just really heavy.
Yeah.
And I'm laughing because it hurts so much.
Yep.
I'm sorry. I just, hearing these stories again and again, even in this process, I am fascinated how much atrocity happens in just a regular day at school.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's both fascinating and really depressing and galvanizing for me.
Yes, right? I would agree with all of that.
We've got to create safe institutions for young people where they can explore their curiosities, but they're honored for who they are. And as America diversifies, right? I don't know any other answer but pluralism, to welcome and invite an actual active invitation to say, bring all of who you are in here. Is there anything we've missed? Anything kind of that you had thought about or you want to bring to the audience? Close in a good way.
Yeah, I just, I'm so glad that you're doing this. And I feel honored to be invited into the conversation. I'm an educator that will forever be a student, right? Learning and growing, staying curious and, again, like speaking to those values that I mentioned earlier and speaking to the antidote to disconnection, right, is just a beautiful, I would just share with anyone listening, a beautiful invitation to get connected, right? And to start with self, absolutely, because you need to be connected to yourself before you're connecting to other folks, or else, it gets messy. And so just an invitation to stay curious and to get connected. And after you've connected with yourself, some, right? And it doesn't have to be I have to wait until I'm perfect at this and doing it. Like, no, you do this as you go and you get better and you grow and you keep going. And so just an invitation to get curious and connect with yourself, with each other, with the earth, with the water, with every and anything that really enhances our life, right? Because all of these things do enhance our lives, whether we recognize that or not. And so just that invitation.
Thank you so much. That's fun.